The story you were taught about Adam and Eve is a mistranslation, a deliberate reframing of something far older and far more psychologically profound. In the Hebrew text of Genesis, before Eve is created, the word used for the first human is not explicitly gendered in the way modern translations suggest. Adam, from Adamah, meaning earth or ground, is described in Genesis 1:27 as being created male and female, both sexes simultaneously, in the image of God, who is also beyond gender. The original human, according to ancient rabbinical traditions and Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, was an androgynous being, complete within itself, containing both masculine and feminine principles in perfect balance. Only later, in Genesis 2, is this unified being separated into two distinct forms, male and female. And this separation is described not as completion, but as a response to the first human's loneliness, to something lacking in the original state. Carl Jung spent decades exploring why this separation happened mythologically and what it represents psychologically, and his conclusion was startling. The splitting of the original androgynous human into separate sexes symbolizes the fundamental wound at the heart of human consciousness, the division of the psyche into conscious and unconscious, the creation of ego as separate from self, and the beginning of the existential loneliness that defines human experience. We are not looking for our other half in romantic relationships. We are trying to reunite the masculine and feminine principles that were split within us, to restore the original wholeness that was lost when humanity was separated from itself. The Gnostic text known as the Apocalypse of Adam, found in Codex 5 of the Nag Hammadi Library and dating to the 1st through 4th century CE, contains a remarkable account of this original unity and subsequent division. In this text, Adam tells his son Seth about their true origin. When God had created me out of the earth, along with Eve, your mother, I went about with her in a glory which she had seen in the aeon from which we had come forth. She taught me a word of knowledge of the eternal God, and we resembled the great eternal angels, for we were higher than the God who had created us and the powers with him, whom we did not know. Then God, the ruler of the aeons and the powers, divided us in wrath. Then we became two aeons, and the glory in our heart left us, me and your mother Eve, along with the first knowledge that breathed within us. This passage is extraordinary for several reasons. First, it explicitly states that Adam and Eve originally existed together, not as separate beings, but as a unified androgynous entity that resembled the great eternal angels. Second, it describes their division not as divine plan for completion, but as an act of wrath by a lesser god, what the Gnostics called the demiurge or Sakla, the false creator who traps divine consciousness in material form. Third, and most psychologically significant, it states that when they were divided, the glory in our heart left us, along with the first knowledge that breathed within us. The separation didn't complete humanity. It wounded humanity, causing the loss of inner glory and direct knowledge of the divine. This is the opposite of the Orthodox interpretation, where Eve's creation from Adam's rib is seen as God's generous provision of a helper. In the Gnostic reading, the division is the original trauma, the first violence against human wholeness. Another Nag Hammadi text, on the origin of the world, provides even more detail about this androgynous original state. The text describes how the instructor is born as an androgynous person and is called Eve of Life by the Jews. This instructor figure, also called Eve, exists before the creation of the physical Adam and Eve as separate beings. The text states, "The authorities call the instructor a beast, but Eve is the first virgin who gave birth without a man." This Eve is not derivative of Adam, but is the primordial source of life and wisdom. Only after her creation do the cosmic rulers mold Adam with the help of their seed and leave him as a lifeless vessel. The material Adam is created by the archons, the rulers of material existence, and is initially lifeless, requiring the breath of the spiritual Eve to animate him. This inverts the entire Genesis narrative. Rather than woman coming from man and being secondary, the spiritual principle associated with the feminine, what the Gnostics called pneuma, or spirit, precedes and animates the material principle associated with the masculine, what they called psyche, or soul. The rabbinical tradition also grappled with the apparent contradiction between Genesis 1:27, which states, "Male and female he created them," and Genesis 2, where Eve is created from Adam's rib. The Genesis Rabbah, an ancient collection of midrash, or commentary, records Rabbi Jeremiah ben Eleazar teaching, "When the Holy One, blessed be He, created the first Adam, He created it with both male and female sexual organs. As it is written, male and female He created them, and He called their name Adam." The text uses Psalm 139, verse 5, "You have formed me before and behind," to support this interpretation of an originally androgynous human, later divided into two. The Kabbalistic tradition developed this concept further through the teaching of Adam Kadmon, the primordial human, understood as a complete androgynous being containing all souls that would ever exist. Some texts describe this being as having two faces, male and female, unified in one body. Others describe it as possessing both sets of reproductive organs. The image throughout these traditions, both Gnostic and Jewish mystical, is of original completeness, wholeness, a human who doesn't need external completion because everything necessary exists within. The separation into distinct sexes is consistently portrayed not as improvement, but as loss, not as divine gift, but as tragic division that creates the fundamental human problem, the search for the other half that used to be integrated within the whole. Jung recognized in these ancient teachings a precise description of what happens psychologically in the development of individual consciousness. The self, in Jungian terms, is the totality of the psyche, containing all opposites in dynamic balance, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, order and chaos. The self is whole, undivided, complete. But for consciousness to develop, for the ego to emerge as a distinct center of awareness, a split must occur. Jung called this the separation of the ego from the unconscious, and he saw it as both necessary and tragic, exactly parallel to the mythological splitting of the androgynous Adam into separate male and female forms. The masculine principle, what Jung called the animus, becomes associated with consciousness, rationality, order, action, the external world, the ego structure itself. The feminine principle, what Jung called the anima, becomes associated with the unconscious, intuition, receptivity, emotion, the internal world, everything that consciousness rejects or can't yet integrate. This split is necessary for individual development because an undifferentiated psyche, like an infant's consciousness, can't function effectively in the world. You need a distinct ego, a masculine organizing principle that can act, decide, discriminate, impose order. But the cost is enormous. The loss of connection to the feminine unconscious, the sense of being cut off from half of yourself, the experience of incompleteness that drives the search for reunion. This psychological reading explains why romantic love carries such intensity and such consistent patterns across cultures. When a man encounters a woman who constellates his anima projection, or a woman encounters a man who carries her animus projection, what's happening isn't just attraction to an external person. It's the psyche recognizing, in projected form, the missing half of itself, the rejected or undeveloped inner opposite that was split off when ego consciousness formed. The person doesn't just want the other person, they want reunification with their own wholeness, restoration of the original androgynous state that was lost in psychological development. Of course, this rarely works as hoped, because you can't achieve internal integration through external relationship. The partner inevitably fails to match the projection because they're a real person, not the idealized inner opposite. But the drive persists because the wound is real. Consciousness is genuinely split, incomplete,
The
longing
Gnostic
for the
texts
wholeness
emphasize
it
that the
lost.
division happened in wrath,
Suggesting that the creator who separated the original androgynous human did so not out of love, but out of jealousy or the desire to limit human power. On the Origin of the World describes how the archons, seeing the luminous androgynous instructor, feared its power and sought to trap it in material form by creating separate, limited bodies. This parallels Jung's observation that societal conditioning, what he called the collective consciousness, actively works to maintain the split between masculine and feminine, both externally, rigid gender roles, patriarchal structures, and internally, suppression of anima in men, suppression of animus in women. A truly integrated human, one who has consciously reunited the inner masculine and feminine, is threatening to systems that depend on people remaining fragmented, controllable, seeking completion outside themselves rather than finding it within. The story of Eve being created from Adam's rib, according to On the Origin of the World, is itself a deception perpetrated by the archons. The text states, "Also the little godlings conspire among themselves, but let us not tell Adam, for he is not one of us. Rather let us bring a deep sleep over him, and let us instruct him in his sleep to the effect that she came from his rib, in order that his wife may obey, and he may be lord over her." The archons deliberately falsify the creation story while Adam sleeps, making him believe that woman came from man and is therefore subordinate, when the actual cosmological truth is that the spiritual feminine principle precedes and animates the material masculine. This false narrative serves to maintain patriarchal control and prevent humanity from recognizing its original wholeness. Jung saw this same dynamic operating in how Western culture, shaped by Orthodox Christianity's interpretation of Genesis, has systematically devalued the feminine principle, both externally in women and internally in everyone's psyche. By teaching that woman was created second, created from man, created as helper rather than equal, and was the primary agent of the fall, Orthodox theology provided justification for millennia of oppression and for the internal suppression of feminine qualities like receptivity, intuition, emotion, connection to nature, and relationship to the unconscious. Men were taught to identify exclusively with masculine consciousness and to project or repress their anima. Women were taught to accept subordination and to develop only qualities that served male-dominated structures. Both sexes were kept from achieving the integration that would restore the original androgynous wholeness. But the Gnostic texts preserve a different teaching, one where Eve, far from being the cause of the fall, is actually the awakener, the one who brings knowledge, the spiritual principle that liberates Adam from ignorance. In the Apocryphon of John, another Nag Hammadi text, Eve emerges from the unconscious depths of the sleeping Adam and awakens him to self-knowledge. The text describes how the archons put Adam in a deep sleep, which the text explicitly identifies as ignorance, and then Eve, as spiritual consciousness, calls him to awakening. Adam himself acknowledges in this text that Eve has given him life. The serpent, associated with Eve, is not the villain, but the agent of gnosis, offering the fruit of knowledge that will break the archon's control. The Orthodox version demonizes the feminine and knowledge itself. The Gnostic version celebrates the feminine as the source of spiritual awakening and liberation from ignorance. This has profound implications for understanding both individual psychology and collective history. If humanity's original state was androgynous wholeness, and the split into separate sexes, and into separated internal masculine-feminine principles, was a violent division that caused loss of glory and knowledge, then the path forward isn't about maintaining gender separation, or even about external equality alone. It's about reintegration, about each person consciously reuniting their internal masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, and about collectively moving beyond the patriarchal structures that have enshrined the division as natural or divinely ordained. Jung called this process the coniunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites, and saw it as the central goal of individuation. The alchemists, who Jung studied extensively, depicted this as the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, where king and queen, sun and moon, conscious and unconscious unite in a reconciliation that produces the philosophical gold of wholeness. The psychological work required for this reintegration is difficult and often resisted because it threatens ego identity. For men, it requires acknowledging and developing qualities that patriarchal culture coded as feminine and therefore weak: receptivity, vulnerability, emotional depth, intuition, surrender to processes beyond rational control. For women, it requires reclaiming qualities that patriarchy allowed only to men: assertiveness, rational analysis, independent action, the right to prioritize individual development over relationship demands. For anyone, it requires facing the shadow, the rejected aspects of oneself, and recognizing that what you've projected onto the opposite sex as other, different, mysterious, or threatening is actually your own split-off inner opposite, seeking recognition and integration. The Gnostic texts present this reunion as not just personal, but cosmic. When Adam speaks in the Apocalypse of Adam about the original state before division, he describes it as a time when they resembled the great eternal angels and were higher than the God who had created us. The implication is that the androgynous state isn't just about gender, but about a level of consciousness that threatens the demiurgic powers by being more complete, more powerful, more directly connected to the true divine source. The divisions serve to limit human potential, to keep consciousness fragmented and therefore manageable. Reintegration would restore not just personal wholeness, but the original spiritual power and direct knowledge that the archons feared and sought to suppress. This is why the teaching about original androgyny was suppressed, declared heretical, buried in the desert for nearly 2,000 years. It's not just that it contradicted the literal interpretation of Genesis. It's that it undermined the entire patriarchal structure of Orthodox Christianity and the broader culture it shaped. If women aren't derivative of men, but represent an equally primordial or even prior spiritual principle, then patriarchy has no divine justification. If the goal is interior integration of masculine and feminine, rather than external hierarchy of men over women, then traditional gender roles become obstacles to spiritual development, rather than expressions of divine order. If the separation of the sexes was an act of wrath by a false god, rather than a gift from the true God, then the entire theological framework that justified oppression collapses. But the teaching survived in the Gnostic texts, in Kabbalistic tradition, in alchemical symbolism, and in Jung's psychological interpretation. And it resurfaces now, in a moment when gender, sexuality, and the relationship between masculine and feminine principles are being radically rethought, both culturally and individually. The Gnostic insight that the original human was androgynous, that the split caused loss rather than completion, and that reintegration is both possible and necessary. This provides a framework for understanding contemporary experience in ways that Orthodox narratives simply can't. Jung understood that this healing can't happen through willpower or intellectual understanding alone. It requires deep psychological work, usually catalyzed by crisis, by the collapse of the old ego structure that maintained the division. The anima in a man, or the animus in a woman, must be encountered, typically first through projection onto external figures, then gradually withdrawn and integrated as one's own inner opposite. Dreams provide the primary arena for this work, as the unconscious presents images of the inner opposite that consciousness must learn to relate to, rather than reject or project. Active imagination, creative expression, and the courage to embody qualities one's gender conditioning prohibited, these are the practical means by which the androgynous wholeness begins to be restored. The ultimate goal, in both Gnostic and Jungian understanding, is what Jung called the conjunctio, the alchemical marriage, where the conscious ego and the unconscious opposite unite in a relationship of dynamic balance. This doesn't mean becoming identical or merged into undifferentiated unity. It means achieving the conscious holding of opposites, where masculine and feminine principles are both active and accessible, where consciousness can flow between them fluidly rather than being rigidly identified with one and defensive against the other. The result is a person who is psychologically androgynous, not in the sense of physical hermaphroditism, but in the sense of internal completeness, no longer dependent on external figures to carry the projected opposite, no longer split against themselves. This integrated state is what Adam and Eve possessed before the archons divided them in wrath, before the glory in our heart left us. It's the state that the Gnostic texts promise can be restored through gnosis, through the awakening of direct knowledge that breaks the archon's control. It's the state that Jung spent his life trying to facilitate in his patients and in himself, understanding it as the highest achievement of human psychological development. and it's the state that remains available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of questioning the narratives they've inherited about gender, sexuality, and the relationship between the masculine and feminine principles, both within and without. The archons may have divided humanity thousands of years ago, according to the myth. But the myth also teaches that what was divided can be reunited, that the original wholeness exists as potential, integrated, and lived. That's the true meaning of being created in the image of God, who is beyond gender, who contains all opposites, who is the androgynous wholeness that humanity lost, and must, through consciousness and courage, find again.